Okay, welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. Today's opinions are going to be about Dandelion Wine by Ray Bradbury. In college, I wrote my thesis on the way time is used in novels. I used 3 different books to illustrate 3 different ways that time works. The Mezzanine by Nicholson Baker, Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern, and The Ambassadors by Henry James. And I never felt that that 3rd book really fit in there. Like, honestly, it uses time in a very traditional way. Like, yeah, it has some flashbacks, it has some stuff that's sort of interesting with using detailed descriptions to stretch out and elongate time, and things like that. But that's pretty common for traditional narrative fiction. Like, honestly, it's what you'll see in most books, and frankly, The Mezzanine does that all significantly more dramatically. So why did I use The Ambassadors in the first place? Well, because I felt like my thesis needed 3 books, and I only had 2 that I really liked for it. So I asked my advisor for suggestions, and she suggested Henry James. And I picked up The Ambassadors. Now, almost a decade later, over a decade later, I finally found what should have been the 3rd book in that thesis. Dandelion Wine. And annoyingly, I tried to read this book when I was a kid. When I was about 10, my sister Erin had just read it, and I really admired Erin and wanted to be smart like her, so of course I picked it up and tried to read it. And I very quickly realized I was too young for this book. And not because of the story. The story in Dandelion Wine is perfectly acceptable for 10-year-olds. The problem is the writing. This is a very poetically written book. Like, honestly, there are really sections of this book that are more free verse poetry than anything else. And frankly, I'm just not great with poetry now, not to mention when I was 10. It doesn't hold my attention. And I can analyze it, I can write essays on it, but I always feel like I'm missing something because I feel like I shouldn't have to force myself to keep reading it, and I do. But this book is only partially poetry, which is why I found it a lot easier to get through. A good portion of it is honestly more short story collection and novel. Dandelion Wine is the story of a summer in 1928, told through the eyes of 12-year-old Douglas and 10-year-old Tom. It is a book of little vignettes painted out with the colors of memory and nostalgia. And some interesting things do happen. Like, don't get me wrong, there are story beats in this book. But it's a book that it feels like listing events would almost be counterproductive to writing an actual synopsis. What this book is really about is capturing the unholdable. Memories, time, and life. Early on in the book, Douglas has this moment where he suddenly becomes intensely, deeply aware that he is alive. And this is a revelation that's inevitably going to lead to another revelation later on when he realizes that that must mean he will one day die. And there is a buttload of death in this book, which is sort of to be expected considering it's by Ray Bradbury. And like, I know Bradbury primarily as a horror writer. I've read a good bit of his horror short stories and books, and I love his horror, though details don't tend to stick with me that well. But when I first started reading this, there was a certain dissonance to me because I was thinking of Bradbury as the horror novelist, and I was wondering, how can this be the same novelist as a man who wrote a book about a skeleton trying to escape from a man's body? But really, Bradbury's horror is always softer. It has always been more thoughtful and more human than, say, for example, Lovecraft. And that's what I love about Bradbury. Everything is beautiful, even the horrific. And this book is exactly that. It is the beauty of the mundane, and yes, also the beauty of the horrific. Which is part of why this book felt like the most Southern Gothic book that has ever not taken place in the South. I mean, it literally takes place in Illinois, which is not the South by any stretch of the imagination. But I struggled not to picture the events taking place in Alabama, or Georgia, or Louisiana. There's a certain love of tradition, a romance, and an old-fashioned sense of place that feels like the South to me. And I also admit that part of the reason this book feels so Southern to me might be because I am from the South. My childhood was in the South. And this book does a stunningly beautiful job of feeling familiar. And I mean, like, none of the events that happened in this book happened to me as a child. These are not my memories. But Bradbury has a great eye for the disconnected details and symbolic descriptions that feel like the way memories work. But there's the random fucking serial killer in the middle. The lonely one is referenced very early on, like I think he actually appears in the very first chapter as a reference, but it feels like an urban legend, and an urban legend feels like it fits in this soft, nostalgic world. But when it turns out he's real, it's a bit jarring. And I mean, this is like a soft, gentle, nostalgia, childhood, good old days kind of book. And then there's suddenly a serial killer. Now, in retrospect, the killer does fit in there. The lonely one really fits a lot of the themes and structure of the book. And that chapter is really the first time Douglas begins to have a revelation that he could die. But it does still feel a little bit like the horror novelist was like popping out to be like, hey, I'm still here. But why do I feel like this book belonged in my thesis? Because it does so many interesting things with time. There's a quote near the end of the book where the boy's grandfather says, "It was over before it began," about the summer. And that's what this book is really about. The impossibility of living with time. The present is the only time we can exist in. Little old ladies have always been little old ladies because they are little old ladies now, and therefore any keepsakes they have from their youth must have been stolen from other little girls. But the past is also physically present. You can call it long distance and it will visit you on the phone line. But also old men can be time machines, taking little boys to times and places they could never know. But then that man dies, and those years die with him. The future is always a looming presence. It is a train barreling down the tracks. It's the threat of school and the future and eventually death. Douglas tries to stop it. Like, a good portion of his real arc in this book is about him trying to stop the approach of time. He spends half the novel trying to prevent things from rushing forward. He actually at one point plays statues with a friend, hoping to freeze him from moving out of town. He even at one point thinks this arcade machine witch will save him from the constant looming threat of death. Time is also in this book the space between two different people. There's this lovely chapter devoted to a couple who are born out of time from each other. The woman is like 90, while the man is 31. He saw a picture of her in the newspaper, did not realize it had been taken 70 years ago, and fell in love with her. And she, as soon as she meets him, thinks he reminds her so much of the man she did not marry when she was young. They only know each other for a couple of weeks, during which time she shares huge portions of her memories with him. And their friendship is really marked by a mourning that they could not share their life together. When she does die, she leaves him with a letter, asking him not to live too long, in the hopes that when they are reborn, they will be reborn closer in time to each other. But this letter also starts by saying she does not believe in reincarnation. So it is all a dream. It's a lie they tell themselves in the hopes of controlling time. But the central metaphor in the book is, of course, the title of the book, Dandelion Wine. Throughout the summer, the family bottles literal dandelion wine, like wine made from dandelions. And Douglas sees this as bottling summer days. He talks about sneaking down to the basement in the middle of winter to steal a sip of summer sunshine. He runs his hands along the bottles, thinking of, this is the day that my friend left. This is the day that this happened. This is the day that that happened. But his grandfather points out the fact that this is finite. There is only a certain amount of dandelion wine. There's only a certain number of times you can come down here and steal a sip of dandelion wine before it's all gone. And therefore, you can remember these summer days, but you cannot revisit them, and eventually they will disappear. This is a really melancholy book, even though it is full of summer fun and playful childhood ideas and beautiful memories. It's a book about holding on to what you cannot hold. And the weight of attempting to hold on to this is what almost kills Douglas at one point. And what is he saved by? Bottled air from another time and place. He is saved by another moment saved from time. I mentioned that I tried to read this book once before when I was a kid, and I was too young for it. And I really was. Because this book is about that feeling of loss. Looking back at your childhood and remembering the things that you can never revisit. And that sort of doesn't work when you're in the middle of childhood. So yeah, I probably couldn't have read this book back then. But it would have been convenient if I had read it any time before college. And also, this is just one of my favorite covers of any book ever.